Okay, Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today. Everyone, Jamie, I'm going to give you the introduction that you deserve. Jamie is one of my favorite cannabis people from all times. I'm really, really blessed to be able to call her a friend. Jamie has a really, really long history of working in this field. She was the communications officer for the Compassion Club when I met her. She was later the president of CAMCD. She was an expert witness in Supreme Court hearings that helped challenge and change some laws in our country. This is a really great honor to have her on. Jamie's also an author and a historian, and perhaps my favorite cannabis historian. And I've talked to a lot in my day, because Jamie, you know that I'm a history buff like you, but I tell you this every time I talk to you, I've never had as much fun, and I don't have as much reverence for anyone on the planet as much as I do for you when it comes to cannabis history. You know, Jamie, nobody's run circles around me in Mexican history related to cannabis like you have. Nobody ever, a Canadian, did that to me. And you taught me so much, Jamie. So thank you so much for being here today. I hope, and still I would like to go on, but still doesn't do justice to you. But thank you so much.
That's so sweet. Oh, thank you. Yeah, you know, you're one of my favorite people as well. I mean, we accomplished some great things together here in the city of Vancouver under Harper. And yeah, I also feel very blessed to call you a friend.
Well, you know, Jamie, and for those of you who don't know, Jamie and I had the pleasure of working alongside Councillor Jang, and he really deserves the majority of the credit. And between you and me, Jamie, you deserve a lot more credit than me, because I'll be frank with everyone out there, all of the successful lobbying work that I did with the city of Vancouver could not have been accomplished without this person hovering above my head right now. So yeah, Jamie and I go way back, and I've dabbled helping government come up with regulations, but not nearly as much as you, Jamie. You've helped at multiple government levels, consultation. I've always considered you one of my mentors when it comes to both history and regulation. I love to talk to you and learn more and grow every time I hang out with you. So to get the opportunity to share that with my students, with my friends, with the general public, I think we've talked about this for a long time, Jamie. So long time coming. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And multiple things around it, including like Japanese punk and yeah. Psychos.
Yeah. Well, you know, both you and I, we have very similar interests, and we have a lot of people don't have exactly the same kind of focuses that we have.
It's true.
Yeah, I think that's why we connect so deeply, Jamie. But today we're going to do this conversation that's about, you know, it's funny because if you and I were to say, what would we like to talk about and what would be the most fun and probably the most also illuminating for a lot of folks out there that have learned a lot about how cannabis was used to demonize Mexicans and Black people for a long time in our part of the world, especially, right? All over the world, but especially in our part of the world. And I think a lot of people are very aware of that history of how this, how in recent times this has occurred. But today we're going to dig into something that I think a lot of people have never even contemplated. It's how far back the discrimination for the cannabis user and grower goes. And the reasons, the historical reasons, both tentative and proven, that we can discuss and learn about. And I think this subject matter, nobody better in the world to talk about it with you, Jamie.
No, thanks.
So yeah, the reason why we have the title, everyone, Scythian, and I'm saying it correctly according to some of my academic counterparts who have corrected me. I've said Scythian for a long time. Scythian apparently is the way academics like to pronounce it in this part of the world. Scythians are a good place to start the conversation, because Jamie and I believe that this is a very crucial moment in history where humans became very close to the plant, but it was a very particular type of human, a very particular type of culture. And that really sets precedent for the future path, the future cultural path, political path, economic path of this plant. So Jamie, who were the Scythians? Tell us.
Well, the Scythian is a Greek word. It's Herodotus gave it to a particular tribe of steppe nomads. they are just one culture that's branched off of a much, much older culture. They're technically credited with introducing cannabis to the Western world, although cannabis had already been there for thousands of years. I think it was possibly the idea of the way that they were using its smoke specifically to purify themselves. That may have been different, but it really wasn't that different, because at the time of Herodotus, one of the most influential religions in the world was actually Inanna, or Ishtar. She's known as Asherah by the Hebrews. And she was really one of the most influential goddesses for thousands of years. The very first author in the world that we know of was her high priestess, and it was a story about Inanna. And
hold on, Jamie. Did you just say the first author in the world?
Yes.
The first scribe in history was a woman.
Yes, well, the first one known as an author for creating prose and rhetoric, which is usually credited to the Greeks. Yes, it was actually her. I cannot pronounce her name. It's Enkuhadi, I believe, in Akkadian. And yeah, she was the first one to like tell a story, at least that we have a record of. And this goddess she was very closely associated with cannabis. The offerings made to her were of cannabis. And so right around like 500, just a little bit after Herodotus becomes in contact with the Scythians. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Just before Herodotus comes into contact with the Scythians, there is a massive movement right across the world. Confucius shows up around that time and starts saying that women shouldn't be involved in fertility rites, even though they were the shamans and the religions for thousands of years. We see the Greeks starting to turn against the different factions that worship that way. Pythagoras was one of those that got kind of pushed out. Socrates, at least according to Plato, was a big proponent of that type of religion and equal rights for women and men. And that's where we really start to see, like, up until that point, it's noticed in the Bible and in archaeology, things weren't quite as patriarchal as we are told. It kind of goes back and forth for a little while, but all of our oldest evidence is matriarchal. And then there seems to be a struggle that takes place over centuries in different cultures, where women who are associated with cannabis in every one of these cultures kind of gets pushed to the side and kind of forgotten, the way that in China right now, they've got a hemp goddess named Magu, who's known for longevity, which is, long lastingness. And she's one of the few deities that Confucians believe in. She's one of the few that survived. And it used to be a much, much richer tradition. And where the Scythians come into it is that they are a member of what's usually referred to as the Central Eurasian Steppe Complex. And it is a bunch of cultures that all kind of came up at different times. We're talking like 10,000 years ago. So there's all of the evidence that we have is mostly like stone. There's not really a lot of plant evidence from this time period. We do find some seeds from like later on, and plants that were buried in tombs and things like that, and references start coming out. But this culture is fascinating because they are thought to have spoken Proto-Indo-European, which is, the presumed mother language of, Indian, like Hindu, Sanskrit, all of the European languages, all of the Iranian languages, the Turkic languages, the Mongolic languages. And at this early time, we know that there's a lot of interplay with the Sino-Tibetan family, which is going to become the other large main group in languages that survive up until today. And we know nothing about this culture, but we know that writing developed independently all along its route. We know that the horse was domesticated on both sides of the route around the same time. We know that cannabis use had already spread from the Yamnaya culture around 8,000. We already know that it spread from Europe all the way to Japan at this point. So there's a lot of really interesting links. They end up, as the languages kind of hint, they end up becoming sort of India. The northern part of India becomes more powerful and eventually unifies all of India. And there's Scythian influences there. But even in the oldest Chinese empire, there are a lot of Scythian influences in the Shang dynasty, the earliest historical attested dynasty in China.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you've made a really interesting connection there, though, because you mentioned how a lot of these cultures, the most ancient ones, we have a lot of indicators of the fact that it was matrilineal. And I always,
Yeah.
I have a background in ethnobotany and ethnoarchaeology, and it's very obvious, even in observing tribal cultures today, why matrilineal structures develop so naturally to humans that have a tribal culture. And I think that you make a really interesting connection between matrilineal traditions and cannabis use within the context of these tribal-based cultures, and how tribalism, feminism become excluded from the power center precisely at that period of time when we know that, which is basically around 600 BC to, let's say, about 200 AD, when China is really taking shape, and when, again, like you said, India already has all of the Indus Valley culture that is essentially already in collapse at that point, right? And so we've had a lot of stuff that's happened where we have a history that's being kind of pushed aside. A history that they're saying, you know what, there's a new ruling elite, there's a new way of doing this. It's very focused on male dominance, and it's very focused also on a new concept of appropriateness and of being civilized, isn't it, Jamie?
Yeah,
So,
well, and you know, there's a lot of interesting examples of that. You know, around 2000 BC in Egypt, they had probably their most successful pharaoh ever, who was a female. A very interesting thing happened was her nephew, who took over after, started defacing all of her monuments, putting his name on them. There was a strong eradication of the goddess. And you can see it. You can see it in the Old Testament. Rebecca talks about how the women are worshiping a completely different goddess. They're worshiping Asherah. Solomon's cool with that when he builds the second temple. It's mostly to Yahweh, but there are Asherah poles in it. You know, Chris Bennett has been saying for a long time that cannabis was a part of that religion. Now archaeology is proving that that is true, and that cannabis was a part of that religion. And it was the same way that it was all across that whole area. It was offerings particularly to a goddess.
yeah, so cannabis was an offering to the goddess. Cannabis obviously was intrinsically tied to all of the ancient cultures. Jamie, this connection with horse rearing and civilization, the other day, please go there, talk about horse rearing and cannabis and the connection between that.
So yeah, so it's also, there's an interesting, you know, the steppe cultures also invented the wheel, the chariot, and domesticated the horse, again, on both sides, right, of this area. All of this stuff appears at about the same time on both sides. What we're going to see like 1,000 years later is that these cultures, like right up until 1400 AD, these cultures control that steppe route that goes from China right across to India and into Turkey. And that is what they've always done. They're normally portrayed as warriors and as barbarians, but really they were just good at that. What they actually liked was trade, and hemp was a major part of that. Again, much later on, the Mongols end up establishing Pax Mongolia, which we were discussing, between 1200 and 400 or 1400. And it was basically the first real postal service in the world. It was the longest trade route you could possibly imagine that was entirely under their control. And they would have stations every like 5 miles or so. And at each station, there was hemp being grown to feed the horses. Obviously, ropes would have been pretty important in trying to domesticate a horse. It's just all intertwined. And again, so far back that there really isn't a lot of evidence. You just kind of have to see what happens later in those areas that develop from it.
So basically, the rope that is so strong from that hemp plant, you're saying that rope, I mean, obviously these people, the central steppe, because again,
the complex,
Scythian is a term we give to these people, but
yes,
they were, what we do know about them is that they were highly ethnically diverse.
Yeah.
They occupied an enormous chunk of land, and there were many factions within them, and they definitely battled within them for superiority between the factions. That type of structure, that type of living is very similar to the nomadic style of living of the northern Chinese area, which of course, Mongolia. And so you said a term there that I think a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people caught it, because we all know about Pax Romana. At least they taught me that in school. Pax Romana was I believe 400 years of peace that the Romans established. There wasn't a lot of war, and it was supposedly quite peaceful, and that's definitely not entirely true, because that's a bit of a mythology created also by the Romans that still persists to this day. 400 years, yeah, there wasn't major wars, but there was uprisings of slaves, and there was uprisings that the Romans had to squash it. The Pax Mongolia does have a historical, this historical idiom that comes along with it, which is that a virgin could walk, I think, Jamie, you can correct me, in midnight from one end at nighttime, from one end of the empire to the other, with a nugget of gold on her head. And she could safely walk from one end of the empire to the other. Now, we can all assume that there's mythology intertwined with that idiom as well. But I think that a lot of Westerners never were exposed to the concept. And I mean, it improve life conditions in the entire area.
It's not very different than I would imagine, 1930s Chicago. If you lived in a mob area, you probably didn't have to worry about much other crime. I know when I lived in New York City, Alphabet City was the same way. There was a Hells Angels clubhouse there. And it was like nobody else was committing crimes in that area at all, right? And so I think the Mongolians were a little bit like that. And then kind of tie into earlier topics. That's another interesting kind of example of this, because Genghis Khan, one of the things that he promoted that helped kind of propel them to control of this entire route was that dowries for women used to be that, at least in the steppe cultures, used to be that if a man wanted to marry a woman, he would go and work for her family for a year. And during that year, they could all kind of decide whether they want to be family, basically. And later on, as they started acquiring things, some men were like, well, I don't really want to do the work. Here's some money. And the family's like, well, that's cool, and they'll just take the money. And so then later that turned into, around Genghis Khan's time, that had turned into basically selling wives. And Genghis Khan put a stop to that. He was like, no, this is absolutely ridiculous. And then, even further to that, as he started expanding his empire, which is bigger than any country today, it went from Russia, covered all of China, covered all of the Middle East, covered part of India, all of Afghanistan, Pakistan.
All the way to Eastern Europe. Yeah.
It was huge. It was absolutely huge. And yes, they were pushing into Eastern Europe at the time of his death. And what he did was, the homeland was split up into 4 different areas, because they were sometimes called the people of the 4 directions. And those were given to his sons. These giant empires that they took over, like China, like the Middle East, were given to his daughters. And that's another thing that kind of gets lost later. Again, we see kind of a pattern that happened in Egypt as well, where the next the next generation rebels against that. There are horrible stories of the leaders going into a village and taking all of the women and splitting them up into 2 teams and making them fight to the death, and then killing whoever stood by. Up to that point, Mongols had been a pretty dualistic culture with leanings towards matriarchy, which had clearly been a lot older, right? And Genghis kind of pushed back against that a little bit. His son Kublai, or his grandson Kublai, did as well. We were discussing this before, the Empress of China being installed there by them. So it was, it was interesting. It's like you probably were very safe on the trade route with your goods, but you probably didn't want to cross the Mongols either.
Yeah, it's so crazy, because since we have that conversation, I did a lot more reading on the Mongols. I was very well read on the Manchurians, which is another, the Mongols, if you look into their belief system, it's basically shamanistic,
Yes. Absolutely.
They're shamans. So yeah, shamans. And again, for those of you who are not familiar, for those of you who are not familiar with shamanist culture. Oh, I forgot to start today's session by acknowledging that we are on unceded native territory. And shamanist cultures, something that I studied very extensively in school, would have been what you would call the religion of our local people here, all into Siberia, all into shamanist cultures were all over the world at one point, in Africa, everywhere. It's the type of religion that becomes very natural for those that are still in a tribal culture, a culture that is a small group of people where everybody has very similar rights, very similar level of equality. Even the chief leads very, very similar than the lowest person on the tribe. And it's a style of life that endured and kept us in balance with nature until quite recently. That's when everything started to go askew. Okay, so
Yeah, well, and it interestingly coincides with writing, right?
Yeah.
As writing started catching on,
and the ideas come out of our head, which, by the way, shamanistic culture, one of the central tenets of it is it has to maintain orally. The connection between the master and the student is the way that it is passed on from human to human to human to human, apprentice, master, in an everlasting chain. And so when you break that chain in a culture, and now it's just books, and you have to choose to read the book. No master is going to come and tell you that you have to be doing this. And that's why CannaReps was built from the concept of mentorship as central. Mentorship from people that have, like you, Jamie, that have actual experience changing things in the real world, challenging power structures, changing power structures. And so that's why shamanism is very important that all of my students understand, and it's very important that all of the general public has a fundamental understanding of what shamanism is, that everything is endowed with a spirit. The land, the animal, the rock, the water, everything is endowed with a spirit. And it is the science, the spiritual science of learning how to interact with those spiritual entities. Okay, and we do that primarily by using those spiritual entities to commune with them. Okay, that's what Native people teach in Mexico as well. We still preserve the tradition of consuming peyote, and I've had the pleasure of consuming peyote that was blessed by a shaman and got a little bit of background. And you know how today we're cheapening this experience greatly. The experience of psychedelics and cannabis is greatly cheapened because we have extracted all of the cultural dimension to it that provides us that connection between mentor, student in a larger culture of a larger chain. So, shamanist cultures in China, I think, Jamie, I'm gonna hand it back to you, but I think, Jamie, the last point you mentioned, Wu Zetian, which was the Empress of China that accomplished so many things in her short reign. Chinese people celebrate her. I mean, I can't tell you what it's like to go to China and to go to her grave and to see the greatness of her grave and how the Chinese government has celebrated what this woman has achieved, because remember that the Chinese government is communist, and communist ideology is very central. Feminism is very central to it. You wouldn't think that necessarily oftentimes by meeting a lot of more modern Chinese people, but the last generation of more hardcore communists were very concerned about celebrating Wu Zetian and about remembering her and her culture, what she brought. And remember that, like Jamie was saying, this concept of the connection between feminism, cannabis, and ancestral culture, I think is something that nobody has remembered, nobody talks about. And I think right now, Jamie, what you're doing is you're giving us the skin, the bones, and the flesh of this thing, so we can actually see it for the first time. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, Wu Zetian, I don't know, Jamie, if like that time period, which again, we're talking about the 600 AD, around there.
Yeah.
That time period, things have started to change because the Scythians have now dissolved into the Iranians. They have dissolved into, well, back then they wouldn't be called Iranians.
Yeah.
No. Back then they would be called Persians.
Yeah.
Yes, it dissolved into Persia. Persia, one of the greatest, most powerful countries of the time. Remember that from these steppe people, from their religion, from their language, arose, like Jamie was saying, you're like Jesus, you call them nomads, you call them nothing, but from that came everything, right, Jamie?
Yeah, well, and it's this interesting idea where somewhere along the line, probably in ancient Sumer, we decided that, you know, if you moved, you weren't an empire. And yet what we see is this Central Eurasian steppe complex has continually created up empires. I mean, I would say right up until the 1400s, but Russia is very much a product of that as well. And they still control a major chunk of that route, right? So it's never gone away. And then again, you know, you look at the you know, the most spoken languages on earth. Well, they both come from exactly where cannabis came from, right? The Yellow River Valley and the Eastern Steppe, they're right beside each other. The wall, the Great Wall is built there. And that's really where the seed of modern China was born, was in that northern China, even though they were looked down upon. You know, you had mentioned that this idea that they're barbarians. You know, the southern Chinese considered themselves very rich and civilized before the northern Chinese were part of the same country. And that's never entirely gone away. You know, there's a very famous description of China as the land of hemp and mulberry. And it's named because that southern part of China was an early human migration that used mulberry plant for a lot of things that cannabis was used for in the north. And so it was very literally hemp and mulberry, but also the mulberry bush was used to grow silk and to make silk, which the rich people wore while the poor people wore hemp. So there's been this weird sort of looking down the nose of cannabis since pretty much forever.
Yeah, and you know, Jamie, it's so crazy because I'd heard, you told me about that idiom before, and until you really broke it down for me right now, I didn't connect all the dots because, you know, my wife has a beautiful story about the Chinese kids oftentimes get the silkworm as a gift. And so that idiom comes to them right away. They're like, oh yeah, there's people of mulberry and there's people of hemp. And like you said, I hadn't put it together that it was the rich South. To this day, Hong Kong is, I mean, you know, they consider themselves much more, and well, Hong Kongese cuisine is not the cuisine of the poor people. Hong Kongese cuisine is like, you go, the dishes are huge. It's, for those of us who have eaten Chinese food here in Canada, you know, we call it Chinese food, but that's mostly Hong Kongese food and adapted to North American style. But yeah, no, I didn't connect the dots until now that what that means to Chinese is that the hemp is of the people and that the mulberry is the silk of the emperors, right? So yeah.
Well, and at that time, I mean, obviously, you know, later silk production got so huge that everybody was wearing silk at one period of time. So yeah. Well,
we've got 600 AD here. So basically, Wu Zetian gets pushed aside, like most of the female empresses of this time period, that they might occupy a bit of power, and then they get elbowed to the side. And what happens after she goes down? Well,
there's a backlash, right? You know, you had mentioned, you know, Mao Zedong's Communist Party, and there's an interesting thing there too, where as much as they revered that empress, at first they didn't like Confucius.
No.
At first they were like, Confucius was a dick, and it's like he ruined everything. And then, you know, decades later, they're kind of like, all right, we got to go back to this because this is what's been really popular, right? And that was, you know, that was a way of staving off, you know, for example, Buddhism, which started spreading through that whole part of the world. Nepal and Tibet are still considered themselves very Buddhist today. That was at a period when cannabis had not been removed, and so from that religion. Later, we see different schools. So today there's like, you know, 4 major schools of Buddhism in the world, and only one really says, yeah, no, cannabis is a good, effective way to reach a state or to communicate with God, basically. And that's, you know, that tradition started going away, just as it did, you know, in the Rig Veda and the Hindu religion. It was the same thing. There's like 4 major schools. Only one of them really still kind of says, you know, cannabis is okay. We see it in the Muslim world with the Shia. Used to be very much on board with cannabis, but modern sensibilities kind of go another way, which also ties to the Mongols, but
exactly.
That's a little bit later. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say, that I look, until I started talking to you about this stuff, I didn't put it together that Xinjiang, which is north west, and Yunnan, which is southwest, are the 2 traditional cannabis producing regions of China. Okay, I was about to go to Yunnan before COVID happened. It broke my heart. So what are Xinjiang and Yunnan? Well, they are independent parts of the country. They have their independent council that provides government for them. Why? Because they are ethnic people that consider themselves separate from the Han Chinese, separate from the Manchurians. They are, and so it really starts to make sense when this thing you're saying about, well, we don't have too much people there that still remember the cannabis and that still celebrate cannabis. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that cannabis was part of the periphery. Remember, like if cannabis would have been part of like the central culture, it got pushed to the side a long time ago because it was connected to this tribalism that was basically being pushed out.
In a way, I mean, you know, the opposite side of that is also true. It was everywhere.
It was everywhere. It was everywhere.
Worth or talking about. It was like talking about air. It's not something that we've done until very recently. We just didn't even think about it, right? And so when we're talking about cannabis use specifically in ritual and religion, that got pushed away very early. But at no point did anybody ever go, let's get rid of this plant and stop using it. They never stopped using it. Right. That's a very, very modern invention. Even, you know, later in the Muslim world around, you know, 1300, 1400, there were some prohibitions against hashish, but they never said get rid of cannabis. Right. Like that was never a thing.
Around the time of Wu Sentian, around that period, there were some moments in China where you see scripture where they make it clear that it was frowned upon to be consuming cannabis, especially smoked cannabis.
Yes.
And to this day, it's very frowned upon to be intoxicated on anything in China. Absolutely. Because I think that like we talked about this before, that Buddhism had a lot of that built into it, where intoxication, constant intoxication as a whole was not viewed as a positive thing. Ritualistic intoxication on specific days with ritual behind it, different story, which is very commonly how Native people use drugs as well. Amongst Native cultures, it's also frowned upon to be intoxicated all the time, but to take your peyote that once or twice a month is, you know, it's all good.
Yeah, same as in India today. But you know, at that same time, Confucius still said, you know, when you wear funerary robes and you're in mourning, it's got to be hemp. Right? So it's like, again,
I get what you're saying. That the textile was so deep into the culture that we know it was there everywhere, and that it wasn't that possible to exclude it. Yeah.
Yes, and nobody even tried. Right. They were talking about, you know, not using certain things, and understand at this point, I mean, it wasn't until contact with Native Americans that people learned how to like roll something up and smoke it. So mostly things were on censers. You know, it would just be kind of burned as almost like an incense, right?
Make a little fire and put.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, you got to think their tolerance had to be really low, right? And so maybe that had an effect on them. This is when we kind of come back to Herodotus when he describes the Scythian use of it. He says they throw seeds on the brazier and they dance around the fumes and it purifies them and it gets them really high, right? It doesn't really make any sense to anybody that's ever used cannabis. It's like, what are you talking about, right? And it's important also to note that Herodotus should have known the difference because it was already in Egyptian medical texts. It was already in Greek medical texts by this point. So again, the cannabis that he had in his world and the word that he used to describe it from the Scythians, which was cannabis, the closest, you know, the actual root of the word today, at least that we've traced back, because the Acadians called it cannabu, right? And so the word was older and somewhat, you know, something a little different, obviously, but it derived from that. Yeah, I forgot where I was going with that completely.
It's all good. I think you were talking about
seeds. Yeah. So there's a couple of different ideas here. You know, Herodotus could have purposefully lied because he didn't want people doing it, you know, back in Greece, even though there were still some cults that did use cannabis as part of their rituals. He could have just, you know, seeds explode when you heat them up like that. And so, you know, he could have just been, you know, something banged and he's like, what the hell is that? And they're like, oh, it's a seed. Right? And so he's like, oh, they used the seeds. The other possibility is that it was hash or some sort of resin. You know, we don't have a written record of hash until later, but it comes from these same people. They introduce it, right? So
oftentimes though, the words associated, for example, cogollo, which is from Latin,
Mm.
It can mean bud and both the thing that keeps the
Yes.
seed. So
Yeah.
I think that because a lot of the priests in Mexico made the same mistake when they make their descriptions, they say, oh, the native people, they're grinding the seed, they're eating the seed, and that intoxicates them. And you're like, well, that doesn't fucking work.
Yeah.
So what they meant is the part of the plant that has the seed was
Exactly.
ground and put, and that's what a lot of historians believe, that's where the translation mistake happens. I believe that that's the case as well, because otherwise it wouldn't fucking make sense, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and we do know that the oldest censer, so we're talking basically about a bowl in which they would put hot stones and then burn. The oldest one we found did not actually have traces of bud in it. It had traces of hashish mixed with opium. That was 2,500 years ago, which is 500 BC. Yeah. And the content of THC was still quite viable and high inside the bowl.
Yes, yeah, I read about that, and it's like there's finds from that all across, and this is another thing, is they find seeds buried all throughout Central Eurasia, with people that they think are great kings or warriors, a lot of them women, priestesses, and it's possible that was a nice big bud. Years ago, right? I think the seeds would survive. I don't know how well the bud would survive, especially depending on the environment and how it's packed. The seeds also could have been something very important for a nomadic tribe to always make sure that you were able to, what if one crop got wiped out when you next, they've got these stop posts all along and they get to one and oh crap, better plant some more seeds, right? There's some very practical reasons why they might have done such a thing.
Well, we know that cow rearing was probably really important about 10,000 years ago at the time of Göbekli Tepe, right?
Yeah.
And in order to do cow rearing and in order to do animal husbandry, you need good ropes. Ropes are like, if you don't have a rope, how the hell are you going to do it, man? Like,
and cheap feed, this is the other thing, is like the earliest uses of cannabis, even when we're talking about hash, some of it was burned, but in the Middle East, for example, they didn't start burning hash until like 1500s. It was something that they ate, right? So that, again, that idea of smoking, and you got to understand, if you threw something on a brazier, I don't know how much of an effect you're going to get if you eat that same amount of hash, especially if it's with a small fatty snack. You're going to feel a lot more than you will from just putting it on a brazier in your tent.
Yeah, and I think that it's a pretty solid consensus amongst academics that the primary use of cannabis was probably edible from very early stages. Yeah,
absolutely. It's considered one of the 5 ancient grains of China, right? It fed that nation. Even today in the Baltics, there's festivals and they eat hemp porridge all through the Eastern Europe. It's still a food source today, though not anywhere near as important as it would have been back then.
No, it isn't. And it's crazy still how much cannabis is grown in the Yunnan and Xinjiang region in China.
Yeah.
And how all of it, primarily it's a type we call chinensis that, naturally speaking, evolved to suit the cultural uses of the Chinese, which were primarily not for intoxication. The Chinese just really, really loved it for their armies and for nation building, because what the Chinese were good at always.
And this is what leads a lot of people today to say, oh, well, they were growing hemp, but that's total bullshit, because it was also being used as a medicine. So while they were focusing on the industrial uses, they weren't unaware of the other uses at all. They were, it's one of the first anesthetics.
And that's one of the interesting things about chinensis, that even though it performs quite well, when you break it up, the stock is quite hardy. The contents can fluctuate. It's usually CBD dominant, like European hemp, but sometimes, because I've actually collected these in China, man, the seeds are as big as peach pits, and the buds are like way denser, different than a European hemp. There's buds on these things. They're chunky, and you can smoke them, and you get high from the hemp plant. So I think for a lot of Chinese people, they would have selected some phenos that were a little bit more stony, and they had the ones that had the big stalk, and but it was all there, man. It was all there. There's no question about it. It's still there today. So they don't regulate very tight.
It never went away.
No, the ethnic people, the Chinese government, we think that they fuck with all of them because they're very, and they do, trust me, and we all know about what's happening in Xinjiang region. But for the most part, the Chinese actually keep very peaceful relations with ethnic people, and they respect the cannabis production and consumption, hashish making. They are hands off because they don't want problems with the ethnic people. They want ethnic people to be integrated into their country, not have to deal with military operations. China has a long history of like every last resort before we have a war. And sometimes that results with some fucked up shit too. But at the same time,
why they have that's
way.
why there's an exemption, right? In Shanxi province, for example, there is an exemption for folk medicine, right?
Yep.
You don't see that in the West.
No.
Anywhere, right?
No, and it's always been there, and it's always been there, and nobody talks about it, you know, like, yeah. So we're, you know, when we touch on the appearance of Sumeria,
yes,
I really think that that's one of the turning points where both matrilineal culture, because at that point is really when it becomes more solidly extinguished. You have the centralized city-state that very rarely has the domination of a female in Sumeria.
well, yes and no. So you know, the major city there at the time, Uruk, it has two districts, and one is Ea and one is Inanna. And Ea is the male god, Inanna is the female god. And that's the section of the city where all the artisans work, where all the crafters work, where all the scribes work. The temple is huge, right? So it's like, yes, you know, we see this, and when the Akkadians come in and take them over about 2,000 years later, it's kind of the same deal. And you know, the king is this dude, but it's his daughter who's the high priestess of the Temple of Inanna, which is still the largest section of the city, which is still the, you know, kind of, it's the New York City of Samaria, right?
No idea.
Culture, right? So it's like, that's what I mean about, it's very interesting to read history that's been written by, you know, 2,500 years of male historians trying to say what things are. You know, there was a funny thing I saw on Twitter the other day. We were talking about these figurines that were found all through Central Eurasia, the Yamnaya culture around 10,000 BC. They seem to be goddesses, and there's all these other objects found with them, and they're dildos. Like they're totally like dildos. They're smooth. And somebody posted the other day, you know, it's like this is a model of a cucumber. Like all these Stone Age people were making models of cucumbers and old women, right? Like it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
You know what's interesting though about that? I don't know about the dildo, but the mother goddess figurine. You find that you find that everywhere on Earth. In Australia, in America, in Siberia, in Africa, you find it everywhere. So there's this a lot of crazy hippie theorists, archaeologists that have the theory that there was an ancient shamanist integrated and globalized culture that could travel, but and had basic boats and stuff. But you know what? I've always said, show me the evidence, basically, and all I know is that period is interesting and it's mysterious. That period, 10,000 BC, there after the end of the Ice Age, very mysterious period in humanity.
It is, but it's also important to remember that just before that is when humanity started separating off into different branches, right? So the people that went to the Americas and the people that went through India and the South Pacific, all the way to Hawaii, you know, those peoples would have shared the same history and culture as the ancestors of the steppe peoples, right? Like things hadn't really split apart that far yet.
So yeah, but it's very mysterious how all these tribal people with low and no technology have such similarities between them and pursue such similar objectives and have such similar cultural, and obviously the theory behind that is, you know, the theory that, you know, it's because that's just how humans are just so similar to each other, genetically speaking. So if you put us in a similar context, we're just gonna do similar stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing as well, right? It definitely is.
So I think that definitely, to me though, it's very clear how the city-state arises, and obviously it starts, we see that pretty clearly with Herodotus, with the Greeks already. Herodotus looks at the Scythians and says, ew, right? He says, those people, Those are not us. Those are barbarians.
Yeah.
Let me describe to you the barbarians.
Yeah.
And
one of the things that pissed him off was that they had female warriors. He didn't like that very much.
he fucking hated that. Oh, they get to draw from twice of their population. And oh yeah, it's just that was the whole point, by the way. That we can kick your ass, you know. But I think that like a lot of people don't realize that there was this group of people that were living a totally different way of life that was antithetical to the way that the people of Sumeria, the Greeks, later the Romans, Egypt, it was quite different than the way all these people looked. And they would look at them and say, oh, and these people that are matrilineal and have these female warriors, they smoke this herb. So I think that connection between the city people and the people that were perceived as wild people endured until very recent. It's what Mexicans are viewed that way, and the African people are viewed that way because we have a lot of tribal culture still there, and
wouldn't have actually taken off if they hadn't stolen so much from them, right? You know, where would the Romans be without the chariot warfare? And you know, same with the Egyptians. It's like they took even the idea of the comitas, which is, you know, a ruler would surround himself with people that would kill themselves when he died. I mean, you still see part of that in Japan, you know, up until very recently. There's all of these ideas that we're taking for culture. It's kind of like if you think of the 60s and the hippies, and you're like, okay, the hippies believed all this stuff. It's based on what the beatniks believed and what the Bohemians believed. And there's like a line of thought. You can actually trace it back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where there's cults that are very similar. They're vegan, you know, they clean with nature. The men tend to have longer hair. It's all these weird similarities. And if you look at what they were asking for, you would say, well, that culture clearly didn't survive. But I mean, rock music was the predominant form of music for at least 20 years, right? And then heavily also influenced hip hop. There's rock influences in it and things like that, which is obviously much older. But even jazz, you know, jazz as a culture was pretty, you know, we think of it as unique and specific with the black turtlenecks and the, you know, the tea houses where they're drinking cannabis. But that dates back, you know, Mark Twain was called a bohemian and written up for eating hash in San Francisco in the 1800s, right? Like there's a cultural thread that runs through, and the dominant story is always that it's just a subculture, that it never really survived, that they're crazy, right? And yet, they tend to have some of the most enduring and lasting impacts.
It's funny because also I think so my family is Catholic, and I think anybody who's Mexican has some degree of Christian influence in their life. My father was a mystic Christian, which means that he studied Kabbalah and he studied a lot of Jewish texts. And if you get really into Jewish history, you find out that Jesus, during that period of time that nothing is written about him in the Bible, was probably studying with a crazy group of hippies in the desert called the Essens. And my father is like obsessed with the Essens. Oh my God, because my dad was a vegan in the 80s, okay? Just so you understand what kind of family I come from, okay? He was feeding me wheatgrass in 92 and I was spitting it out going, what the fuck is this shit? Okay, that's the family that I come from. The Essens, he always told me that a real Christian should know that Jesus' body was embalmed with cannabis oil when he died, that Jesus would have probably been around cannabis with the Essens, because about what we know about the Essens was a group of people that only ate light. So they were vegans as well, did not eat meat. And they very regularly fasted in order to exchange communication with the gods. It was a highly shamanistic culture, highly tribal culture. That's where Jesus went to become Jesus. Okay, before that, yeah, people were already praising him because of the alignment of the stars or whatever. But without that culture, that cannabis culture, which again, he goes into the Middle East. Okay, well, he's in the Middle East. He goes deeper into the desert where he's living in the Middle East. That's where this group of Jewish people live. They are a Jewish sect, a Judaic sect, okay? They were called a sect, one of my favorite of all times, because they were no violence. They were no oppression. So no owning other people, no owning land, no owning possessions. they were a lot like the aesthetic monks of India, which still exist today, which are people that by their religious inclination will never own things. They don't want to experience great pleasures. That's another reason why, as a Buddhist and as an aesthetic and as all these people, you don't eat meat and you don't eat a lot of spice because you don't want to have that moment of, because that's not what they're teaching. And all of that stuff, right, that those later religions turned away from. Think about what cannabis is. Cannabis is that moment of, and that thing becomes a problem for the civilized people. Civilized people.
Literally flips, right? It's like, here, this will get you closer to God. This will help you celebrate, whatever it is that's out there, right? It'll put you in touch with nature or the universe, and then it suddenly becomes, don't ever do that.
Oh, never.
Like, oh, that's no, never mind. Forget that. Forget what we said that, right? And then they purposefully start playing word games with it, where they'll start calling it different things, so you don't realize it's the same thing that's all around. And it's not like, it wasn't like U.S. prohibition was the first to do that. That happened again and again and again and again, where it was just like, oh, no, you want to stay away from this stuff, it'll get you high. But this is a completely different word. It's a completely different plant. It's fine. And it's the same damn plant, right? Like,
oh, the word play. That is just hilarious. I read your article the other day, Jamie. So good. For those of you who haven't read it, it's called "What is Cannabis? Wrong Answers Only." Is that what the? Yeah. You have to read it because the contemporary twisting of words is really something, I think, and definitely a recollection of everything we've done before. I think that's kind of the point of today's session, that we're stuck in a perpetual repetition. And we think that everything is new and nothing is new, and we don't learn anything, and we just keep rolling forward. It doesn't make any sense. We've already made all these mistakes. We've already discriminated against our neighbors because they live different or they think different. And we utilize the plant as an excuse to say, yeah, well, that's for dirty people. That's for ignorant people. That's going to make you dumb. That's going to make you... We've already done this so many times over. And the Christians are hilarious because no, the blood of Christ is wine. Not cannabis, it's wine. No, not cannabis, it's wine. I'm like, what? When did that happen, man? When did they decide that the blood of Christ would be the most poisonous liquid you could possibly drink? No. It's not true. It's not true, because wine had less alcohol content and wine was different back then. So was beer. I get it. I know, but
small beers. Yeah.
Nobody was drinking the tequila and...
But at the same time, there's early Christian religions that didn't have a problem with cannabis. The Gnostic Ethiopian church, the Coptic churches today are still the same, right? It's
true. The oldest ones are the ones that are cool, funnily enough.
Significantly older than the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, exactly. So
it just feels as we become more modern, we just keep moving the dial further and further this way. And even though we want to say that we celebrate native culture so much and we respect shamanism so much. And no, we really don't. No. That's the thing. We can say it all we want. Exactly. But it's excluded, and there's no room for telling a doctor that maybe health has more to do than with your concept of what smoke is.
Yes.
Maybe
that's been tainted by what we do to tobacco, which is not necessarily, is way worse than what tobacco smoke used to be.
And it's crazy also because, again, it's just like everything else is traditional tobacco consumption was always mixed with other stuff. Like if you have it in a traditional setting, and what a different experience it is. And it can actually sometimes give you a little bit of because there's something in there that's actually, tobacco gives you a little, but mixing it with other stuff. Today we, like the tobacco that we're going to obtain is going to have all this other stuff in it. People mix their hashish in it.
Chemicals,
there's so much tobacco in cannabis culture in Europe today, because cannabis culture is so...
I will never take a joint from anybody in Europe. Europe, they pass me a joint, I'm like, I used to ask the first few times I'd ask. Now I just don't even ask. I'm just like, no, I know you've got tobacco in it. No thanks. And
the Europeans can't smoke with us, Jamie, because we hand them a joint. Jamie, you have a tolerance that is legendary, first of all. And if they smoke what you and I smoke, they'd be like, you didn't put tobacco in this. This is dangerous. It's too much cannabis. I'm gonna get really...
I mean, the ICBC conferences have been great going to Berlin every year because every time, you know, the Canadians have this reputation for just being like crazy potheads. They smoke so much cannabis and they see the size of our joints and it takes them a second to realize, wait, there's no tobacco. You're smoking a joint that big that's just cannabis by yourself. Are you insane? You know, and of course, you know, it's prohibition was heavily in effect in a lot of places still in Europe. And so you don't get it as easily and as readily. There's a need, it's understandable why it would be stretched out, right? Like why you would, try and take what little you could get and make it last, right?
Oh my God.
But at the same time, it's not hard to actually get it. Like I've never had a problem, even before I was in the cannabis industry, I've never had a problem getting cannabis anywhere in Europe, right? Like never. It's not, again, you're not going to necessarily find an ounce very easily, but it's not hard to find cannabis.
It was never hard to find cannabis. It was always hard to find good cannabis all over the world. And it was hard to find, how should I say, a source that was not totally sketchy in Europe before legalization. Europe was like, man, it was hardcore in UK. People used to show up. I would buy a couple ounces and the guy would show up with a gun. I'd be like, what do you think is gonna, dude, it's weed. Not even a Mexican shows up with a gun to a fucking weed deal, man. That's crazy stuff. Yeah. You know what we should do, Jamie? Because we talked about this briefly. We should really do a little bit of background about how tobacco history gets intertwined with cannabis history. And that moment, right before it really hits, right before everything happens, before colonialism happened, that the Muslims really move everything around and they school all of us in terms of what cannabis is and how it's used and how it's not used, et cetera, et cetera. Muslims were quite already familiar with cannabis by the time that modern European cultures become a little bit more acquainted. And I love that moment where, well, I hate colonialism, but it's so interesting, that moment when colonialism begins and now hashish is there. And you have all of this stuff that happens early on in Europe.
Well, and this and this is what I mean. It's like, because when we're talking about different words, right? Europe was extremely familiar with cannabis.
Very familiar.
Extremely familiar with it. Familiar as a food, familiar as a, 1500s royalty was already paying people to grow cannabis because they couldn't get enough cannabis for industrial purposes. It was hash that they were not familiar.
There you go. Yeah, it says the intoxicating form. Yes.
Yeah, and so yes, Napoleon invading Egypt. He brought a whole bunch of scientists and historians and archaeologists with him. He wanted to learn, everything he could about Egypt while invading it.
What an asshole.
and that kind of really flooded hash in. Hash had probably wasn't the first time in Europe. It had gotten around, right? But it wasn't popular by any stretch of the imagination. There were no stores where you could get it. You couldn't necessarily ask around for it. But, after Napoleon, that it became, and again, we tie back to the subcultures, right? Where it became writers. And it was the literary world that took to hash, but also the medical world. There was a time period in France where medical doctors were like, holy shit. It's like, yeah, we knew about cannabis and we used cannabis for certain things, but, we never thought of hash. And it's like, this is the next miracle drug, right? And right around that same time, Napoleon, his soldiers are smoking hash. There's hash eating clubs that are opening up in Paris. Among these literary, giants today, Charles Baudelaire, like some big freaking people, right? And so it was stomped down again because here's this counterculture that's showing up and making people think about stuff. And
it's African. Oh, it's African. Oh no, it's Muslim. Oh no.
Ourselves. Like this is another thing that kind of gets lost a lot, I think, in discussions around this time period. It's like this is a product that we can't produce. Like when sugar became really popular, there's no move to ban it. Every country moved to be able to produce its own. Right? Same thing with cotton. They tried to, okay, well, how do we produce our own? Hemp had already been going through that for thousands and thousands of years, right? Hash comes along and it's like, they don't even know that they can make their own hash. They're just like, oh, well, we got to buy it from like Afghanistan and Lebanon and Egypt. Interestingly enough, it only shows up in Morocco later, partially, because of the Arab caliphates, partially again, because of the French influence. So there's this really weird sort of back and forth, things just kind of, they flow, right? And you know, you try and clamp it down here and it's going to pop up over here. And it's like, that's always been the case with cannabis. There's been all kinds of things that have been discovered and learned and then lost or stamped out, and they pop up again, right? And medical use is a perfect example where, you know, they really went after medical use hard, and there was no medical use at all for a few decades. You still can't keep it quiet, right? Like, it still comes back up, right? And it keeps coming back up in multiple different formats and uses. And it's really interesting how we talk about, like, you know, sugar changed the world. And it's like, but sugar was sold in cones wrapped in hemp paper. You know, we talk about how cotton, you know, changed the world, but the bales of cotton were tied together with hemp. You know, the boats that made this possible, also unfortunately the slave trade possible, was hemp rigging. It was hemp sales, and it wasn't just being able to grow it; it was having the know-how to produce it. Right? Russia, one of the reasons why it's a powerful country today, actually had to do with them being able to sell hemp to England and to the United States for hundreds of years, because, you know, as the American Navy ended up proving later, their process for making rope and sail was just better than anybody else's, and they, you know, they couldn't figure it out. Like, they couldn't copy it, right?
I think that we're gonna have to take a whole nother. Next session we're gonna come back. And I think we're going to start in this time period exactly, which is right, because what I want to do is I have to juice your brain a bit for American history as well.
Oh God!
I want to talk. Yes, I want us to talk about that period when France instituted the first prohibition in Europe, because they did not like the soldiers getting high on that stuff. They didn't like the artists getting high on that stuff. Just like the States, they were like, no, we don't like this. This is not European enough. And so they cancel it. When that happens, it starts to set off, because that's essentially, you know, a jump and a skip from the Prohibition era, which is the beginning of the moment where people say no more alcohol in a bunch of places.
Well, and in between there, we screw with tobacco and opium really badly.
Yeah, and screw with opium in ways that a lot of us Anglophones forget exactly what our beloved queen was doing to the Chinese, and how much we like to cast the Chinese as the people that are the oppressors and the worst thing on this nation and in this world. And the truth is that the Chinese have a long 300 years of being slapped around by the Europeans and having been really abused by our countries for so long, and the impact that left on them in relation to how they think about drugs. In China today, all drugs, they have one word: poison. That shit is poison. And that's how they think about it, primarily because we shoved opium down their throats. We wanted them to take it so we could make enough money to build our empires in Europe. So remember that this time period that we're gonna come back to is that moment when all of this craziness starts bubbling up, and it becomes something that we inherit. We, the children of those cultures, inherit.
We still, I mean, one of the centers of that conflict, it was downtown Vancouver East Side.
Well, that's why I want to talk about this, because our town and our country has so much to do with all of this stuff, and Canadians don't think that we're that central in the global story of how things moved, and that endures to today. We don't, you know, Jamie, you mentioned very early the effect of the Hells Angels on this country, and I call it the Pax Hells Angels as well, because frankly, without the Hells Angels, look, I don't care if this is an unpopular opinion. Hells Angels have a lot of things to them that I don't agree with. Gangs can have net positive effects for poor people.
Yes.
And that's been proven and proven and proven and proven. In Sinaloa, where I have worked, it's one of the safest states in my country, because the narco does not allow theft, does not allow rape, does not allow anybody to go and mess around with fundamental human standards that they enforce. And the government doesn't do it. Okay? The government doesn't do it. And yes, they murder people, they kidnap people. They're not, look, I'm not saying the narco is a good thing for Mexico, because that would be fucking madness, okay? What I am saying is that the world is not black and white, and that the history of cannabis is intertwined with this switching of the black to white to the gray, always intertwined in this really complex and amazing storyline, that the better we know it, the better that we are armed to change our current world, to change the way people think today, how we think about ourselves. So Jamie, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time, giving us your knowledge today. And I'm so excited to have you back next month and go to America from Europe. We're going to do that. Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank
Amazing.
you.
Mexican Revolution time.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we'll have to cover that. Yeah, a little bit.
We got to do it all. We got to do Canada. We got to do Mexico. And briefly, because it's very deep subject matter, but we're going to leave the past behind and go towards the future and hopefully arm people to understand their present even a little bit better than they do. Yeah?
Nice.
Everyone, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye. Thanks, Jamie.